World War II, one of the most catastrophic events in human history, was shaped by many factors. At its core, it was a battle between powerful nations and ideologies, but one figure stands out: Adolf Hitler. As the leader of Nazi Germany, Hitler's decisions were pivotal in shaping the war's outcome. His rise to power and his dreams of creating a massive, powerful empire led to the devastating conflict that engulfed much of the world. Yet, despite initial successes, Hitler ultimately lost the war. Many wonder, what went wrong? Was it his overconfidence, his strategic errors, or the sheer resilience of the Allies? In this video, we'll explore why Hitler lost World War II and what mistakes he made that could have been avoided. By understanding Hitler's errors, we gain insight not only into the war itself but also into the nature of leadership, strategy, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. His mistakes were not simply the result of bad luck but the culmination of poor decisions, miscalculations, and a failure to adapt to changing circumstances. This video will delve into these missteps, giving a clear picture of why Hitler's vision for the Third Reich was doomed to fail. One of the main reasons Hitler lost World War II was his strategic mistakes, which severely impacted Nazi Germany's chances of success. These mistakes were not isolated incidents but rather a series of poor decisions that compounded over time, leading to the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. The decision to invade the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. Arguably Hitler's biggest strategic blunder was his decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. The initial success of the Nazi military in Europe had made Hitler overconfident. He believed that the Soviet Union was weak and that the German army could easily conquer it, just as they had done in France. However, the harsh reality of the Soviet Union was far different. The vast size of the Soviet Union, the harsh winter conditions, and the strong resistance of Soviet forces all contributed to the failure of Operation Barbarossa. Instead of completing a swift victory, the German forces found themselves stretched thin across an enormous front. The logistical challenges were overwhelming, and the Germans were not prepared for the brutal winter that hit them in late 1941. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union left him fighting a war on two fronts, which drained vital resources and manpower. This stretched the German military beyond its capabilities, and the failure to capture key Soviet cities, including Moscow, marked a turning point in the war. Failure to focus on strategic priorities. Another strategic mistake Hitler made was failing to focus on key objectives. Rather than prioritizing the defeat of the British or ensuring victory on the Eastern Front, he often diverted resources to projects that were of little strategic value. One such example was his obsession with developing new weapons, such as the V-2 rocket, which consumed valuable resources without significantly changing the course of the war. These weapons were impressive in terms of technology but had limited impact in the larger strategy of the war. In addition, Hitler's focus on ideological goals often led him to make decisions that disregarded military practicality. For instance, he ordered German forces to fight for every inch of territory, even when retreating or regrouping would have been a wiser strategy. His unwillingness to allow his generals to make independent decisions further harmed the German war effort. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States in December 1941 was another disastrous strategic decision. Initially, the United States was neutral, but after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, America entered the war. Despite the threat posed by the US, Hitler made the mistake of declaring war on them, believing it would not make much of a difference. However, the economic and military power of the US was far greater than Hitler had anticipated. The US was able to mobilize its industry and military resources to support the Allied cause in a way that Germany could not compete with. American involvement in the war provided the Allies with vital supplies, aircraft, and tanks that turned the tide against Germany. The US also played a crucial role in the eventual defeat of Japan, allowing more Allied resources to be focused on the European front. Hitler's failure to gain air superiority over Britain during the Battle of Britain in 1940 was another critical mistake. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was initially successful in attacking British airfields and radar installations. However, Hitler made the error of shifting the focus to bombing British cities instead of continuing to target military and air defense infrastructure. This allowed the Royal Air Force, RAF, to recover and regroup. The British were able to use radar to detect incoming German bombers, and the RAF, although outnumbered, fought bravely to protect Britain's skies. Had Germany succeeded in gaining air superiority, an invasion of Britain would have been much more likely. However, the failure to defeat the RAF meant that Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was never carried out. Another critical oversight was Hitler's neglect of Germany's naval capabilities. Unlike Britain, which had a strong navy, Germany did not have the naval strength to dominate the seas. Hitler focused on land and air warfare, but the lack of naval dominance meant that the Germans struggled with securing vital supplies from overseas. The British blockade and the eventual involvement of the US in the Atlantic further strained Germany's resources. Hitler's tendency to ignore the advice of his generals and military experts was another strategic mistake. He was notorious for micromanaging military operations, often overruling his commanders and making decisions based on his own beliefs rather than sound military strategy. His refusal to delegate decision-making to competent military leaders led to several costly mistakes. For example, during the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler ordered his troops to hold the city at all costs, even when the strategic value of doing so had diminished. This decision led to the encirclement and eventual surrender of the German Sixth Army, which was a catastrophic defeat. In summary, Hitler's strategic mistakes, his decision to invade the Soviet Union, his failure to focus on key objectives, underestimating the United States, his mistakes in air warfare, neglecting naval power, and his refusal to listen to his generals, were all major factors in his defeat in World War II. These errors were compounded by overconfidence and ideological rigidity, leading to the downfall of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain, fought between July and October 1940, was one of the most pivotal moments of World War II and a crucial turning point for Hitler's military strategy. It marked the first major defeat of Nazi Germany's military forces and played a key role in preventing Hitler's planned invasion of Britain, known as Operation Sea Lion. In the early stages of the war, Germany had enjoyed a series of swift victories across Europe. By the summer of 1940, Nazi forces had successfully conquered much of Western Europe, and Britain stood as one of the few remaining obstacles. To break Britain's resolve and pave the way for an invasion, Hitler needed to achieve air superiority over the British Isles. This meant that the German Luftwaffe, the air force of Nazi Germany, would need to neutralize the Royal Air Force, RAF, which was the primary line of defense for Britain. The Luftwaffe's strategy and the RAF response. The Luftwaffe initially focused on attacking British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. These objectives were critical for crippling Britain's ability to defend itself. At the same time, Germany sought to destroy the RAF's fighter planes, which was seen as the most significant threat to a potential invasion. However, the RAF, under the command of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, proved to be a formidable opponent. One of the main advantages the RAF had was the use of radar, which allowed them to detect incoming German aircraft at long range. This technological advancement gave the RAF a crucial edge, as they could quickly scramble fighter planes to intercept the Luftwaffe before they reached their target. Moreover, Britain's extensive network of underground bunkers and airfields, along with the tireless efforts of the RAF pilots, meant that Britain could sustain the battle, despite heavy German bombing campaigns. The shift in German strategy. Initially, the Luftwaffe focused on targeting British airfields and radar stations. However, after the Germans mistakenly bombed London on August 24, 1940, Hitler shifted his strategy. Instead of focusing on military targets, German bombers began targeting London and other civilian areas. This change in strategy allowed the RAF to regroup and strengthen its defense against the Luftwaffe. The German bombings, while damaging, gave the RAF the opportunity to repair and rebuild, which prolonged their ability to fight. While the bombing of London, known as the Blitz, had a significant psychological impact on the British public, it was not enough to break their will to fight. The resolve of the British people and the determination of the RAF pilots, many of whom were young and inexperienced but brave nonetheless, proved to be a formidable challenge for the Luftwaffe. The outcome and its impact. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority over Britain, and the Battle of Britain ended in a decisive British victory. The RAF, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, had managed to thwart Germany's efforts and prevent an invasion. Germany's inability to destroy the RAF meant that Hitler's plans for Operation Sea Lion were effectively put on hold. The battle marked the first significant defeat for Hitler and was a major turning point in the war. The failure to win the Battle of Britain had long-lasting effects on Nazi Germany. It delayed Germany's plans for a Western invasion and forced Hitler to shift his focus to the Eastern Front, leading to the disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Moreover, the battle boosted Allied morale and gave hope to nations under German occupation. It proved that Nazi Germany, despite its initial successes, could be beaten. The Battle of Britain also demonstrated the importance of air superiority in modern warfare. It was a precursor to the large-scale aerial battles that would take place later in the war, including the battles over Europe and the Pacific. The RAF's success in repelling the Luftwaffe not only saved Britain but also preserved the Allies' ability to launch a counteroffensive, which would eventually lead to the defeat of Nazi Germany. In conclusion, the Battle of Britain was a pivotal moment in World War II that had a profound impact on Hitler's military strategy. The failure of the Luftwaffe to gain air superiority marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's ambitions in Western Europe. The bravery of the RAF pilots, the technological advantage of radar, and the resilience of the British public played a crucial role in this victory, which would shape the course of the war and the future of Europe. One of Adolf Hitler's most consequential mistakes during World War II was his decision to declare war on the United States on December 11, 1941, just days after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. This move would prove disastrous for Nazi Germany, as it opened up a second front for Hitler, one that he was ill-prepared to handle, and ultimately played a significant role in the defeat of the Axis powers. The context of the decision. Before Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Hitler had already been engaged in war with Britain and the Soviet Union. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, had been neutral but supportive of Britain and the Allies through the Lend-Lease program, which provided military aid. While Roosevelt and the American public were sympathetic to the Allied cause, there was no formal declaration of war between the US and Germany. The United States, at that point, was focused on its own isolationist policies and was reluctant to enter the conflict, especially in Europe. However, Hitler's alliance with Japan, through the Tripartite Pact, led him to make a fateful decision after Japan's surprise attack on the US Navy base in Hawaii. In a show of solidarity with his Axis partner, Hitler declared war on the United States, even though the US had not declared war on Germany. This decision was made despite warnings from several of Hitler's advisors, who believed that Germany was not ready to confront the military might of the United States. Strategic misjudgment. Hitler's declaration of war against the US was rooted in a combination of hubris and miscalculation. He assumed that Japan's success in the Pacific could keep the United States occupied and prevent them from fully focusing on the European theater. Hitler believed that Germany's advanced military strength, particularly its formidable Luftwaffe and U-boat fleets, could withstand the US military's industrial might. Additionally, he overestimated the disunity within the Allied powers, underestimating the determination of the United States to join the fight. Hitler also hoped to destabilize the war in Britain by engaging the United States. He believed that with the US now involved, Britain would be forced to divide its resources and attention between two fronts, making it easier for Nazi Germany to eventually defeat them. However, this was a serious misjudgment. The US had not only the world's largest economy but also the capacity to produce vast amounts of war material and weapons, which would ultimately bolster the Allied effort significantly. The US response and the war machine. The United States had a vast industrial base and an economy that was far more capable of sustaining a prolonged war than Nazi Germany's. Once the US entered the war, it rapidly ramped up production of weapons, tanks, aircraft, and ships, turning the tide in favor of the Allies. The US military's technological superiority and strategic resources allowed them to outmatch Germany in every aspect of warfare, from naval battles to advanced weaponry. Germany, already stretched thin on multiple fronts, was unable to compete with the sheer scale of American industrial power. The declaration of war also unified the United States, which had previously been divided over the prospect of entering the conflict. After Pearl Harbor, the American public rallied behind the war effort, and the US military quickly mobilized. This created a formidable adversary for Germany, one that could support both the European and Pacific theaters of war. Hitler's decision to declare war on the US thus turned the conflict into a global war, one that Germany was ill-prepared to fight on two massive fronts. Impact on the Axis powers. By declaring war on the United States, Hitler solidified the full commitment of the US to the defeat of the Axis powers. This drastically changed the strategic landscape of the war. Before this declaration, Germany had hoped to win the war in Europe while Japan kept the US distracted in the Pacific. However, with the United States now fully engaged on both fronts, the balance of power began to shift. In the Pacific, the US quickly retaliated against Japan, eventually leading to the defeat of the Japanese Empire. In Europe, the United States provided essential support to the British and the Soviet Union, enabling them to hold the ground against German forces. The US military also launched its own offensive in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France, opening up new fronts and forcing Germany to fight a war on multiple fronts, which it could not sustain. The final blow to Nazi Germany. The United States' involvement in the war had far-reaching consequences for Nazi Germany. The US military's entry into the war not only provided a significant boost to Allied forces but also deprived Germany of the ability to achieve its strategic objectives. The pressure on Germany's resources became insurmountable, and with the US joining the war effort, Nazi Germany was eventually overrun from both the east by the Soviet Union and the west by the Allies, leading to its eventual collapse in 1945. In conclusion, Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States was one of the most significant strategic blunders of World War II. His miscalculation regarding the strength and resolve of the United States, along with the overconfidence in Germany's own military capabilities, led to the full mobilization of American industrial power and military force. This marked a turning point in the war and sealed Germany's fate, ultimately contributing to its defeat. The entry of the United States into World War II was a critical factor in the downfall of Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. One of the key factors that led to Adolf Hitler's downfall during World War II was his unwavering focus on ideology over sound military strategy. While military leaders throughout history have often been guided by practical considerations, Hitler's fixation on his Nazi ideology, racial superiority, and the concept of Lebensraum, living space, clouded his strategic judgment and severely hampered Germany's chances of success. This blind adherence to ideology ultimately played a crucial role in Germany's defeat. Hitler's ideological obsession. From the outset of his leadership, Hitler was deeply committed to a vision of an ethnically pure Aryan state, and this vision influenced nearly every aspect of his policies, including his military strategy. Hitler's ideology revolved around the belief in the superiority of the German people and the need to expand eastward to provide land for the Aryan race. This expansionist policy, which he believed was vital for Germany's survival, led to his decision to invade Poland and, later, the Soviet Union. Hitler's obsession with racial purity also influenced his decisions on the treatment of civilians in occupied territories. He often prioritized ideological goals over military practicality. For example, his decision to exterminate millions of Jews and other, undesirable, groups diverted essential resources away from the war effort. The concentration camps and genocide, which were central to Nazi ideology, created immense logistical and human resource burdens that detracted from Germany's military capabilities. Impact on military strategy. Hitler's ideological commitment to Lebensraum and his racial theories led to key strategic errors on the battlefield. For instance, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, in 1941, although initially successful, was driven in large part by Hitler's desire to expand German territory at the expense of the Soviets. While this was a rational objective from an ideological standpoint, it was a grave strategic mistake. Hitler underestimated the vastness of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the harsh winter conditions. This miscalculation led to the overstretching of German resources, contributing to one of the most catastrophic defeats in history. Furthermore, Hitler's belief in the superiority of the Aryan race led him to dismiss the potential value of alliances with other nations. For example, Hitler's reluctance to form a true alliance with the Soviet Union, despite the fact that it could have been beneficial for both sides, meant that Germany faced a war on two fronts. This ideological stubbornness exacerbated the challenges of fighting the war, especially after the United States entered the conflict. Underestimation of practical military needs. Another key issue with Hitler's focus on ideology over strategy was his failure to grasp the practical requirements of waging a global war. Hitler often interfered with military decisions, believing he had a superior understanding of strategy, despite lacking the training or experience of professional generals. His insistence on military campaigns that aligned with his ideological goals led to costly missteps. For example, during the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler insisted on capturing the city, not for its strategic value, but because of its symbolic importance. He was fixated on capturing a city named after Joseph Stalin, viewing it as a humiliation to Soviet morale. Instead of focusing on critical military objectives, Hitler's obsession with symbolic victories led to a disastrous siege that decimated the German Sixth Army, significantly weakening Germany's position in the war. Failure to adapt. One of Hitler's greatest flaws as a military leader was his inability to adapt his strategy when the situation changed. His rigid adherence to ideology and the belief that the German army was invincible prevented him from recognizing the changing tides of war. While the Allies were quick to adapt to the evolving nature of the conflict, particularly with new technologies and strategies, Hitler remained mired in outdated notions of warfare, often dismissing expert military advice that conflicted with his ideological views. In 1944, after the D-Day landings in Normandy, Hitler refused to allow his generals the flexibility to make necessary adjustments. He often issued orders based on his beliefs about what the enemy should do rather than responding to the reality on the ground. This stubbornness led to strategic delays and missed opportunities to repel the Allied forces. Ideological-driven decisions over practical military concerns. Hitler's priorities often led to the neglect of military efficiency in favor of ideological goals. For example, his insistence on securing ideological goals like the establishment of the New Order in the occupied territories interfered with military planning. Hitler placed high importance on a victory that was seen as part of his larger vision for a racially pure empire, even at the expense of crucial military objectives. His tendency to prioritize the ideological significance of battles, such as those in the East, led to catastrophic losses that Germany could ill afford. The impact of Nazi ideology on the German military. Finally, the very core of Nazi ideology also affected the way Hitler treated his military leaders. He believed that loyalty to the Führer was more important than professional competence. As a result, many capable generals were sidelined, and the military was forced to focus on political loyalty rather than merit. Hitler's interference in military affairs, combined with the prioritization of his personal vision, caused significant discord within the ranks and ultimately undermined Germany's military effectiveness. In summary, Adolf Hitler's unwavering focus on ideology over strategy was a major factor in his downfall. By placing his Nazi ideals above sound military judgment, he made critical errors that could have been avoided. His obsession with territorial expansion, racial purity, and symbolic victories led to the suffering of millions and, ultimately, to the defeat of Nazi Germany. If Hitler had prioritized practical military considerations and listened to the advice of his generals, the course of World War II might have been very different. His blind adherence to his ideology remains one of the most significant strategic failures in history. Adolf Hitler's overconfidence and hubris were significant factors that contributed to Germany's eventual defeat in World War II. Hubris, or excessive pride and arrogance, led to a number of strategic blunders and poor decisions that ultimately played a role in the downfall of the Nazi regime. Hitler's overconfidence not only clouded his judgment but also prevented him from listening to his military advisors, ignoring key facts and warnings that could have changed the outcome of the war. Early signs of overconfidence. Hitler's initial success during the early stages of World War II fueled his sense of invincibility. The rapid and successful invasions of Poland, France, and other European countries in 1939–1940 led Hitler to believe that he could not be stopped. The blitzkrieg tactics employed by the German military seemed to have overwhelming success, and Hitler's forces were often able to conquer vast territories in a matter of weeks. This early success led Hitler to develop an overinflated sense of his own military genius and the power of his leadership. Refusal to adapt. One of the most notable consequences of Hitler's overconfidence was his refusal to adapt when circumstances began to change. As the war dragged on, the initial victories were overshadowed by strategic mistakes and the growing strength of the Allies. Despite evidence that Germany was overstretched and facing significant challenges, Hitler continued to believe in the superiority of the German military and his own ability to control the situation. This hubris became particularly evident when Hitler ignored the advice of his generals. Throughout the war, many experienced officers, such as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, warned Hitler against making certain decisions, including the invasion of the Soviet Union and the declaration of war against the United States. However, Hitler dismissed their concerns, believing that his vision and leadership were infallible. His refusal to trust his military commanders and his belief that he knew better than anyone else led to the disastrous outcomes on multiple fronts. The invasion of the Soviet Union. Perhaps one of the most significant examples of Hitler's overconfidence was his decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941, a campaign known as Operation Barbarossa. Hitler underestimated the vastness of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the harsh winter conditions. He believed that the Germans could defeat the Soviets quickly and decisively, as they had done with many other nations. This belief was rooted in Hitler's hubris, as he thought that the German army was unbeatable and that the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of the German assault. However, the invasion became one of the most catastrophic failures of the war. The German army was unprepared for the long and brutal conflict that ensued, and the Germans suffered heavy casualties. This disastrous miscalculation, fueled by Hitler's overconfidence, marked the beginning of Germany's downfall on the Eastern Front. The failure at Stalingrad. Another example of Hitler's hubris was his insistence on capturing Stalingrad in 1942. Stalingrad was of little strategic value, but its symbolic importance made it a key target for Hitler. The city was named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and Hitler saw it as a means to deal a psychological blow to the Soviets. However, Hitler ignored the strategic advice of his generals, who believed that focusing on other objectives would be more beneficial. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in a devastating defeat for Germany, with the German Sixth Army being encircled and forced to surrender. Hitler's insistence on capturing the city despite the mounting difficulties and his refusal to allow his commanders the flexibility to retreat or change tactics led to a massive loss of men and resources. This battle is often seen as a turning point in the war, marking the beginning of Germany's decline. The declaration of war on the United States. Hitler's overconfidence also played a role in his decision to declare war on the United States in 1941. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler, in a moment of arrogance, chose to declare war on the United States, despite the fact that Germany had not yet fought a war on two fronts. Hitler believed that the United States would not be able to mobilize quickly enough to pose a significant threat, and he underestimated the industrial might and military capabilities of the US. He also believed that Japan's alliance with Germany would lead to a unified Axis effort that could defeat the Allies. This decision turned out to be another costly error. The United States quickly mobilized, sending troops and supplies to both the European and Pacific theaters. Hitler's refusal to consider the potential ramifications of declaring war on such a powerful nation further stretched Germany's resources and doomed the Axis powers to failure. Failure to listen to advisors. Hitler's overconfidence also manifested in his relationships with his military advisors. While he initially worked with experienced generals, his growing belief in his own strategic genius led him to sideline many of his top military minds. He began to interfere directly in military decisions, issuing orders that were not in line with sound strategy. His refusal to listen to his generals' advice led to disastrous results in several campaigns, most notably the invasion of the Soviet Union and the failure at Stalingrad. In the end, Hitler's overconfidence and hubris were key factors in his defeat. His belief in his own infallibility blinded him to the realities of warfare and caused him to make critical strategic mistakes. His refusal to listen to experienced advisors, his underestimation of the Soviet Union and the United States, and his insistence on pursuing ideological goals rather than military objectives all contributed to Germany's loss in World War II. If Hitler had been more humble, more willing to adapt, and less driven by his personal ego, the course of the war could have been very different. Ultimately, his overconfidence became one of his most fatal flaws. One of the critical factors in Hitler's defeat during World War II was his failure to secure reliable and supportive allies. While Germany initially formed alliances with Italy and Japan, these partnerships were either weak or strategically flawed, and they contributed little to Germany's war effort in the long run. Hitler's inability to foster strong and lasting alliances left Germany isolated, facing a coalition of powerful nations without the diplomatic or military support needed to succeed. The pact with Italy. In the early stages of the war, Italy, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, was a key ally of Germany. Both nations shared fascist ideologies and a desire for territorial expansion, making them natural partners. However, Italy's involvement in the war was far from beneficial for Germany. Mussolini's forces were poorly equipped and often performed badly in combat. In North Africa, for example, the Italian military was defeated in battles with the British, forcing Hitler to send German troops to support the Italian forces. The famous German general Erwin Rommel was sent to North Africa to lead the Afrika Korps, attempting to stabilize the situation. However, this stretched German resources further and proved to be a drain on their military efforts. Mussolini's lack of military competence and strategic insight meant that Italy's contribution to the Axis war effort was minimal. Hitler's reliance on Italy, therefore, proved to be a strategic error, as Italy's failures created more problems for Germany rather than helping him achieve the goals. The pact with Japan. Germany's alliance with Japan was another crucial mistake. Although both nations were part of the Axis powers, the partnership was more symbolic than practical. Japan and Germany had different strategic priorities and were focused on different theaters of the war. Japan's primary interest was in expanding its empire in Asia and the Pacific, while Germany was focused on Europe and the Soviet Union. This lack of coordination between the Axis powers meant that they could not support each other effectively when needed. The most damaging mistake was Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. While Japan's attack on the US brought America into the war, Germany had no direct conflict with the United States until that point. By declaring war on the US, Hitler further isolated Germany and angered a nation with enormous industrial capacity and military power. This action proved to be a costly error in judgment. Lack of a strong strategic partnership with the Soviet Union. At the outset of World War II, Hitler's main strategy involved conquering large parts of Eastern Europe, which included the Soviet Union. Initially, Hitler signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union in 1939, a non-aggression pact that gave Germany the freedom to invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. However, the alliance was purely tactical and based on convenience, rather than a genuine, strategic partnership. Hitler, driven by his ideological hatred of communism and his desire to expand the Third Reich, had always planned to betray the Soviet Union. In 1941, Hitler broke the pact by launching Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This decision not only created a deadly two-front war but also eliminated any possibility of securing the Soviet Union as a meaningful ally. The failure to secure a long-term diplomatic relationship with the Soviets significantly weakened Germany's position and contributed to the eventual defeat on the Eastern Front. The failure to win over other European nations. While Germany initially had some support from countries like Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, these nations were either unwilling or unable to provide substantial military assistance. In many cases, they joined the Axis powers under duress or because of their own territorial ambitions, but their loyalty was not reliable. For example, Hungary and Romania, while technically allies, were often reluctant to fully commit their forces or resources to the German cause. This lack of reliable support further isolated Germany as the war dragged on. Hitler's efforts to secure alliances with other European countries were often clumsy and based more on coercion than diplomacy. His strategic errors, such as his invasion of the Soviet Union and his refusal to negotiate with neutral countries, led to a situation where many countries either remained neutral or actively opposed Germany. As a result, Germany faced an increasingly hostile Europe, with few reliable allies left to support their war efforts. Inability to exploit potential allies. Finally, one of the biggest failures in Hitler's diplomatic strategy was his inability to cultivate alliances with countries that could have been valuable to the Axis powers. For instance, Spain, led by Francisco Franco, was a fascist regime sympathetic to Germany's goals. However, despite initial overtures, Franco refused to fully commit to the Axis cause. Hitler's attempts to pressure Franco into sending troops to fight in Russia or elsewhere were unsuccessful, and Spain remained officially neutral during the war. Similarly, countries like Turkey and Sweden, which had strategic importance, were either neutral or leaned toward the Allies. Hitler failed to recognize the value of these nations as potential allies, and his diplomatic failures allowed the Allies to exploit these countries for their own strategic benefit. In summary, Hitler's failure to secure reliable and capable allies played a major role in Germany's defeat in World War II. His alliances with Italy and Japan proved to be weak and ineffective, while his inability to maintain a stable relationship with the Soviet Union left Germany vulnerable on the Eastern Front. Furthermore, his diplomatic mistakes, including alienating potential allies and failing to build a strong coalition of nations, further isolated Germany and left it fighting a two-front war with little support. In the end, the lack of solid and dependable alliances was a critical factor in the downfall of the Third Reich. The impact of the Allied resistance during World War II played a significant role in Hitler's defeat. From the very beginning, the Allies, particularly the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union, mounted fierce opposition that drained Germany's resources, disrupted its strategic objectives, and ultimately led to its downfall. Their ability to resist and counterattack German advances had far-reaching consequences for Hitler's war plans and significantly weakened the Axis powers. The Battle of Britain and the air superiority. One of the earliest and most crucial moments of Allied resistance was the Battle of Britain in 1940. After the fall of France, Germany turned its attention to the United Kingdom, intending to launch a large-scale invasion. However, the British Royal Air Force (RAF) effectively resisted the German Luftwaffe's aerial assault, inflicting significant losses on the German Air Force. The failure to achieve air superiority in the skies over Britain meant that a German invasion was no longer feasible. This defeat marked the first major setback for Hitler's expansionist ambitions and kept Britain in the war as a key base for Allied operations in Europe. This battle also marked a turning point in the Allies' morale, demonstrating that Germany was not invincible. The Luftwaffe's inability to break British resistance provided the Allies with the confidence needed to carry on the fight. It also delayed Hitler's plans for an invasion of Britain and shifted his focus to the Eastern Front, leading to a strategic overreach that contributed to Germany's eventual defeat. The Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front. One of the most decisive moments of Allied resistance came on the Eastern Front. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa was a monumental strategic error. The Soviet Red Army, despite initial losses and setbacks, managed to regroup and resist the German advance. The Soviet resistance, particularly during the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942–1943, marked the turning of the tide in favor of the Allies. The encirclement and eventual surrender of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad represented a catastrophic blow to Hitler's forces, with more than 300,000 soldiers lost. The Soviet Union's ability to absorb immense casualties and keep fighting, coupled with the harsh winter and logistical difficulties, eventually wore down Germany's war machine. The Soviet forces pushed the Germans back, and the Eastern Front became a key factor in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The continuous resistance and successful counteroffensives by the Soviets left Germany overextended and struggling to maintain supply lines, further weakening its position. The United States' industrial and military power. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was another critical factor in the downfall of Nazi Germany. The United States' immense industrial capacity allowed it to produce vast amounts of war materials, from tanks and airplanes to ammunition and supplies. This production capacity helped to fuel the Allied war effort and overwhelmed Germany's ability to sustain its military campaign. In addition to providing material support, the U.S. military played a significant role in the defeat of Germany. American forces, along with British and other Allied troops, conducted a series of successful campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. The D-Day invasion in June 1944, which saw Allied forces land in Normandy, France, marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. The successful Allied invasions and offensives tied up German forces on multiple fronts, stretching them thin and preventing them from concentrating their strength in any one area. The strategic bombing campaign. In addition to direct military resistance, the Allied bombing campaign against German industrial centers and cities had a major impact on Germany's ability to sustain the war. The British Royal Air Force, followed by American bombers, carried out strategic bombing raids that targeted German factories, transportation hubs, and military installations. The bombings severely disrupted Germany's industrial output and transportation infrastructure, leading to shortages of vital supplies and resources for the German military. While the bombings caused significant civilian casualties and destruction in German cities, they also drained Germany's resources, forcing Hitler to divert more of his military forces to defend against the raids. The continuous Allied air assault ultimately weakened Germany's ability to fight effectively, contributing to the eventual collapse of the Nazi war effort. The resistance movements within occupied Europe. Throughout Nazi-occupied Europe, resistance movements played a significant role in undermining German authority and military operations. These movements carried out acts of sabotage, gathered intelligence, and provided vital support to the Allies. In countries such as France, Poland, Norway, and Yugoslavia, local resistance fighters disrupted German supply lines, destroyed key infrastructure, and harassed German forces. These activities, while often small-scale, made it increasingly difficult for Germany to maintain control over occupied territories. The resistance also helped to boost morale within occupied countries and provided the Allies with valuable intelligence. The efforts of resistance movements were particularly important during the lead-up to the D-Day invasion, where French and other European resistance groups played a crucial role in gathering information and sabotaging German defenses. The impact of Allied resistance in World War II was a decisive factor in Hitler's defeat. From the strategic bombings and the Battle of Britain to the Soviet counteroffensives and the strength of the United States' industrial and military contributions, the Allies managed to frustrate Hitler's ambitions at every turn. The unity, resilience, and ability to fight on multiple fronts eventually overwhelmed Germany's overstretched military and resources. The combined force of these resistances, along with the weakening of German morale and the steady loss of territory, played an irreplaceable role in bringing about the fall of Nazi Germany. Hitler's leadership style was one of absolute control, which ultimately hindered his decision-making and the success of his military strategies during World War II. While he was undoubtedly a charismatic leader capable of inspiring fierce loyalty from many of his followers, his lack of delegation and obsession with centralized power led to several strategic blunders that contributed to Germany's defeat. One of the key aspects of Hitler's leadership was his tendency to micromanage military operations. Rather than trusting his generals and high-ranking officers, he frequently intervened in tactical and strategic decisions, overriding the expertise of military professionals. This was particularly evident in the early years of the war when Germany achieved several key victories. However, as the war progressed, this micromanagement began to backfire. Hitler's refusal to delegate authority and trust his commanders led to disorganization, confusion, and poor decision-making, especially on the Eastern Front and during the invasion of the Soviet Union. For example, during the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler insisted on holding the city at all costs, even when the situation became increasingly dire for the German Sixth Army. His insistence on no retreat and his refusal to allow field commanders to make tactical decisions led to the encirclement and eventual surrender of the Sixth Army, one of the most significant defeats for Germany in the war. Another critical mistake was Hitler's inability to delegate authority to his subordinates effectively. He was often suspicious of his generals, which created an atmosphere of mistrust within the high command. This lack of trust in his military leaders not only demoralized his officers but also led to inefficiency and indecision. Hitler's decision to personally oversee military operations rather than relying on the expertise of his generals resulted in a fragmented command structure and an inability to respond quickly and effectively to changing battlefield conditions. Furthermore, Hitler's leadership style was highly ideologically driven. He often made decisions based on personal beliefs or the dictates of his Nazi ideology, rather than pragmatic military considerations. This included his refusal to negotiate peace with the Allies and his focus on the destruction of the Jewish population rather than the more immediate military needs of Germany. These factors led to flawed strategic choices and missed opportunities for Germany during crucial moments in the war. In conclusion, Hitler's leadership style, marked by centralized control, lack of delegation, and ideological rigidity, played a significant role in Germany's eventual defeat in World War II. His failure to trust his military leaders, coupled with his interference in strategic decisions, undermined the effectiveness of the German war effort. The final defeat and surrender of Nazi Germany in 1945 marked the culmination of a series of strategic errors, relentless Allied pressure, and internal collapse. By early 1945, the German war machine was in disarray. The Eastern Front was crumbling under the weight of the Soviet advance, while the Western Allies had successfully landed in Normandy in 1944, pushing through France and into Germany. Hitler's refusal to consider retreat or peace talks led to catastrophic losses for the German forces. In Berlin, the situation was dire. Hitler, isolated in his Führerbunker, continued to issue commands that were unrealistic given the dire circumstances. His obsession with maintaining the defense of every inch of German territory, even in the face of overwhelming enemy forces, sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Despite efforts to regroup and launch counterattacks, such as the Ardennes Offensive in December 1944, Germany's resources and manpower were exhausted. The Allies were relentless, advancing on all fronts with ever-increasing force. By April 1945, Soviet troops had encircled Berlin. The city was under heavy bombardment, and the German forces inside had little hope of holding out. Hitler's refusal to surrender or acknowledge the inevitability of defeat prolonged the suffering, but by May 7, 1945, Germany formally surrendered to the Allied forces. The unconditional surrender marked the end of Nazi Germany's reign and brought an end to World War II in Europe. Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker just days before, unable to face the reality of his failed empire. The defeat of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany offers several critical lessons that can be applied to leadership, decision-making, and the conduct of warfare. One of the most significant takeaways is the importance of humility and the ability to learn from mistakes. Hitler's refusal to listen to his military advisors, overconfidence in his own judgment, and rigid ideological beliefs led to catastrophic decisions that ultimately resulted in Germany's defeat. A leader must be willing to adapt to changing circumstances, trust in the expertise of their team, and make pragmatic decisions based on reality, not ideology. Another key lesson is the dangers of overextending military forces and underestimating the strength of an enemy. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union and engage in a two-front war, despite the lessons from World War I, stretched Germany's military capabilities to their limits. This failure to consolidate power and properly assess the long-term implications of his actions ultimately led to the collapse of the Third Reich. The role of alliances and diplomacy is also evident in Hitler's downfall. His failure to secure strong and reliable allies, coupled with the alienation of potential partners, left Germany isolated against a coalition of powerful nations. In contrast, the Allied powers were able to work together, pooling resources and military strategies to defeat the Axis powers. In conclusion, the lessons from Hitler's defeat emphasize the dangers of autocratic leadership, the importance of strategic foresight, and the necessity of cooperation. By reflecting on these lessons, we can better understand how failure in leadership can lead to disaster, and how wise decisions and humility can lead to success.